They called him a fool for returning the horse, and in a place like this, that word could weigh heavier than a loaded rifle. Out on the edge of Dry Creek, where the wind carried dust like memory and every man learned early to take what he could and hold it tight, Ethan Cole stood alone beside a fence that leaned just enough to tell you it had seen better years. The horse didn't belong to him. Anyone with eyes could see that. Black coat, deep as midnight after a storm, muscles clean and strong beneath the skin, and a saddle marked with symbols no white rancher would ever carve. Apache markings. The kind that meant something. The kind that made men look away and pretend they hadn't noticed. It had wandered into his corral sometime before dawn, quiet as a thought you don't want to finish, standing there like it had chosen him. Most men would have shut the gate and thanked their luck. A horse like that could fetch more than a season's worth of cattle. Enough to fix the roof, maybe buy back a piece of land already slipping through his fingers. Enough to change things. But Ethan Cole wasn't most men, and that was the problem. By mid-morning, word had already spread. It always did. A couple of riders stopped by, boots hooked over their saddles, hats tipped low against the sun, watching him like they were waiting for a show. "You keep it," one of them said, casual as a man talking about the weather. "Finders keepers out here." Ethan didn't answer right away. He just stood there, one hand resting lightly against the horse's neck, feeling the steady warmth of it, the quiet strength. The animal didn't shy away. Didn't act wild or afraid. Just breathed, slow and even, like it trusted something Ethan wasn't sure he deserved. "It ain't mine," he said finally, voice low, like the words were meant more for himself than anyone else. The men laughed, not cruel, but close enough. "Out here, that don't matter," another said. "What matters is what you can hold on to." Ethan looked past them, out toward the open land stretching for miles, where fences thinned and lines blurred into nothing but sky and dust. Somewhere out there, someone was missing this horse. Someone who knew those markings, who would follow tracks the way other men read letters. He felt it in the stillness, in the way the wind seemed to pause between breaths. This wasn't luck. This was a test. He reached for the rope, slow, deliberate, like every movement carried weight. "Then I reckon I ain't holding on to it," he said. And just like that, he made a choice most men wouldn't understand. By afternoon, he was already riding south, leading the black horse behind him, heading toward land no one entered without reason. The kind of land that remembered who you were, and what you came for. 3 days later, the same men who called him a fool would stand in that same dust, hats in hand, watching the horizon darken with riders returning something far greater than a horse. The land changed the farther south he rode, not in ways a map could show, but in the way the air felt thinner, quieter, like every sound had to ask permission before it traveled. Ethan Cole kept a steady pace, counting miles by the rhythm of hooves and the slow tilt of the sun overhead, the black horse following without resistance, its presence behind him constant, almost deliberate. He had seen horses before that fought the rope, that pulled back, that tested a man's patience, but not this one. This one walked like it understood where it was going, like it had already made the journey in its mind long before Ethan ever touched the reins. By the second day, the fences were gone entirely. No more leaning posts or broken wire, just open land stretching wide and unclaimed, or at least unclaimed in the way white men understood ownership. Ethan could feel it in his bones, that invisible line people spoke about in lowered voices, the one you crossed without seeing, and once you did, you were no longer just a man passing through. You were something being watched. He stopped once near a dry creek bed, letting both horses drink from what little water pooled between stones, and for a moment, the world felt almost still enough to forget where he was headed. But even in that quiet, there was a weight to the silence, something that pressed against his back like eyes he could not see. He did not reach for his rifle. He never did unless there was no other choice. Instead, he checked the black horse again, running. His hand gently along its side, pausing at the faint swelling near its front leg. The injury was not deep, but it had not been treated. He tore a strip from his own shirt, wrapping it carefully, his movements slow, respectful, the way his father had once shown him when tending to animals that did not yet trust the hand that helped them. "You belong somewhere," he murmured, not expecting an answer, but feeling the truth of it settle between them anyway. By the time the sun dipped low on the third day, painting the horizon in colors that looked almost like fire without the heat, Ethan saw the first sign that he was no longer alone. It was not a sound. Not at first. It was the absence of one. The wind shifted, then stopped, like the land itself was holding its breath. The black horse lifted its head, ears forward, alert but not afraid, and that told Ethan more than anything else could. He did not turn in a hurry. He did not reach for anything. He simply stood there, one hand resting loosely near the rope, the other at his side, waiting. When the riders appeared, they did not rush in. They came like shadows rising from the earth itself, silent, controlled, their horses moving with a kind of grace that made the ground seem softer beneath them. 5 of them. Maybe more beyond the ridge. Enough to remind any man that he was outnumbered before a single word was spoken. Ethan did not count them twice. He did not need to. He already knew this moment had been coming since the second he chose not to close that gate. The lead rider stopped 10 yards out, posture straight, presence steady, and though no weapon was raised, the air between them felt sharper than any drawn steel. Ethan slowly loosened his grip on the rope and let it fall slack, giving the black horse room to step forward if it chose. He did not speak right away. Out here, words came second. Truth came first. And sometimes, truth was nothing more than standing still when every instinct told you to run. No one spoke at first, and that silence carried more weight than any accusation ever could. The riders sat tall in their saddles, their eyes fixed on Ethan with a kind of calm that did not need to prove itself. The black horse shifted slightly, then stepped forward on its own, the loose rope dragging softly across the dirt as if it had already decided where it belonged. Ethan let it go. That was the first thing he did. Not a gesture of surrender, not fear, just a simple truth made visible. The lead rider watched closely, his gaze moving from the horse to Ethan, then back again, measuring something that could not be named out loud. A second rider circled wide, not closing in, just observing, like a man reading tracks long after the dust had settled. Ethan kept his hands where they could be seen, his posture steady, his breathing even, the way a man stands when he has nothing to defend and nothing to hide. The black horse stopped halfway between them, turning its head slightly as if listening for a voice it already knew. That was when she stepped forward. She moved without hurry, her presence quiet but undeniable, the kind that made the others give space without being told. Nayeli. Her eyes went first to the horse, scanning every detail, the saddle, the markings, the way it carried its weight, then slowly, deliberately, to the strip of cloth tied around its leg. Something shifted there, subtle but real, like a thought she had not expected to find. She stepped closer, reaching out, her hand brushing the bandage, fingers light, careful, recognizing the work of someone who knew what they were doing. Ethan did not speak. He knew better than to fill a moment like this with words that could not carry their own weight. Nayeli straightened, her gaze lifting to meet his, and for a brief second, the world seemed to narrow to that single exchange, no wind, no movement, just two people standing on opposite sides of a line neither had drawn but both understood. She said something then, low and steady, in a language Ethan did not know, but the tone was clear enough. A question, or perhaps a challenge. Ethan did not pretend to understand. He simply shook his head once, then gestured lightly toward the horse, then back toward her, the meaning simple, unadorned. Not mine. The riders did not react right away. They watched her. Waiting. The kind of waiting that showed where the true authority rested. Nayeli studied him a moment longer, her expression unreadable. But her eyes held something different now, something that had not been there when she first stepped forward. Not trust. Not yet. But something close to it. She moved to the horse again, checking the bandage more closely, then adjusting it with a precision that told Ethan she had done this many times before. The horse lowered its head slightly, calm under her touch, and that seemed to settle something unspoken among the riders. The tension did not disappear, but it shifted, like a storm that had decided not to break. Nayeli turned back to Ethan, her voice this time in careful English, each word placed with intention. "You brought him back." It was not a question. Ethan nodded once. "He was not mine to keep." The words hung there, simple as they were, and yet they carried more than any explanation could. Nayeli held his gaze, searching, weighing, and then she gave a small nod of her own. Not agreement. Not approval. Just acknowledgement. She spoke again to the others, brief, precise, and the riders began to ease, their posture no longer coiled with the same readiness. One of them stepped forward to take the horse's lead, guiding it back with quiet respect. No one thanked him. No one offered anything in return. And that, somehow, made it clearer than words ever could. Ethan stepped back, giving them space, his part in this already finished the moment he chose to return what was never his. As the riders turned and began to move away, the dust rising softly beneath their horses, Nayeli lingered just a second longer. Her eyes met his once more, and there was something in that look that did not belong to the past 3 days, something that felt like it was still deciding what it meant. Then she turned, and they were gone, leaving Ethan alone again in the wide, open silence, with nothing in his hands and no reason to expect anything more. The ride back felt longer, though the distance had not changed. Ethan Cole moved north at the same steady pace, the same measured rhythm of hooves against dry earth, but something in the air had shifted, something he could not quite name. The land behind him remained silent, as if it had accepted his presence for a moment and then closed itself again without a trace. No riders followed. No voices called out. Just wind, low and restless, brushing across the open plains like a memory already fading. By the time he crossed back into the edges of familiar ground, the sun had already begun its slow descent, stretching shadows long and thin across the dirt. His ranch came into view the way it always did, small against the wide horizon, worn but standing, a place that asked little and gave even less. The fence still leaned where he had left it. The gate hung slightly open. Nothing had changed. And yet, as he stepped down from his horse and walked toward the corral, he paused for just a second, his hand resting on the rough wood, feeling the grain beneath his fingers like it might tell him something he had missed. He had returned empty. No horse. No reward. Not even a word beyond what had already been spoken. That was how it was supposed to be. Out here, doing the right thing did not come with applause. It came with silence. Inside the small house, the air was still, carrying the faint scent of dust and old wood, the kind that settled deep into the bones of a place. Ethan poured himself a cup of water, drinking slowly, his eyes drifting toward the window without really seeing what lay beyond it. For a moment, he thought about the look in Nayeli's eyes before she turned away. Not gratitude. Not suspicion. Something in between. Something unfinished. He set the cup down, the sound soft against the table, and let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Outside, the evening settled in the way it always did, quiet and unremarkable, the sky fading from gold to deep blue, stars beginning to press through the darkness one by one. A man could live his whole life out here without anything ever truly changing. That was the promise of a place like this. Or the warning. The next morning came like any other. Early light, cool air, the slow work of tending to what little there was to tend. Ethan moved through it without hurry, fixing a loose board along the fence, checking the water trough, the kind of tasks that filled time without asking questions. If there was anything different, it was only in the way he found himself listening more than usual, his attention drifting toward the horizon. Without reason. By midday, a couple of riders from town passed by again, their curiosity not yet satisfied. "So you really gave it back," one of them called out, leaning slightly in his saddle, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. Ethan did not look up right away. He kept working, driving a nail into place with a steady hand before answering. It was not mine, he said simply. The man laughed, shaking his head. You keep thinking like that, you are going to end up with nothing. Ethan finally glanced up, his expression calm, almost distant. Maybe, he said. But it will be mine. The riders moved on, their laughter fading into the distance, leaving behind the same quiet that had always been there. Ethan returned to his work, the rhythm of it steady, familiar. And yet, somewhere deep in that quiet, there was a feeling he could not ignore. Not expectation. Not hope. Just the sense that something had been set in motion the moment he chose to let go. And out here, on land that remembered every choice a man made, things like that had a way of finding their way back. By the third day after he returned, the land had settled back into its usual rhythm, the kind that made a man believe nothing out of the ordinary would ever cross his path again. Ethan Cole worked through the morning with quiet focus, repairing a section of fence that had leaned too far for too long, the wood dry and stubborn beneath his hands. The sun climbed slow and steady, pressing heat into the ground, into his shoulders, into everything that moved and everything that stood still. It should have been just another day. And yet, sometime past noon, something changed. It started small. A shift in the wind. Not stronger, not colder, just different, like it carried something with it that did not belong to the usual dust and distance. Ethan paused, hammer in hand, listening without turning his head. Out here, a man learned to notice what did not fit before it became something he could not ignore. At first, there was nothing. Then, faint and far off, a rhythm began to form. Hoofbeats. Not one. Not two. Many. Still distant enough to mistake for thunder if a man wanted to lie to himself, but steady enough to tell the truth. To anyone willing to hear it. Ethan set the hammer down slowly, wiping his hands against his worn shirt as his eyes moved toward the horizon. A thin line of dust had begun to rise, stretching low across the land, too wide to belong to a single rider, too deliberate to be chance. He did not rush. He did not reach for his rifle. He simply stood there, watching, the way a man watches something he knows has been coming long before it appears. Within minutes, the shapes began to take form. Riders. More than he had seen before. Their movement was not hurried, not aggressive, just steady, controlled, like a river that did not need to prove its strength. The same presence he had felt days earlier, only now it carried weight. By the time they reached the edge of his land, there were at least a dozen, maybe more trailing behind the rise where the ground dipped just enough to hide their full number. Ethan stepped forward from the fence, not to meet them halfway, but to make it clear he was not hiding behind anything he owned. The lead riders slowed first, their horses easing into a stop just beyond the boundary of his corral, dust settling slowly around them. And then he saw her again. Nayeli rode at the front this time, not behind, not among them, but clearly the one they followed. Her posture was the same, calm, grounded, but there was something else there now, something that had not been present before. Not tension. Not suspicion. Something closer to decision. Ethan's gaze moved briefly across the others, taking in their numbers, their stillness, the way they held themselves without needing to speak. This was not a visit made lightly. This was something carried with intention. The silence stretched between them again, but it felt different this time. Less like a test. More like the moment before an answer is given. Ethan stood with his hands at his sides, his expression unchanged, waiting without expectation. He had already done what he came to do days ago. Whatever this was, it did not belong to him. Nayeli dismounted slowly, her boots touching the ground with quiet certainty, and for a brief second, no one else moved. Not the riders. Not the wind. Even the dust seemed to hang in place, as if the land itself was listening. She stepped forward, closing the distance just enough to speak without raising her voice, her eyes steady on his. And though she had not yet said a word, Ethan understood something in that moment that could not be explained. This was not about the horse anymore. This was about what a man chose to do, when no one was watching. She did not speak right away, and that was the first thing that made it clear this moment carried weight. Nayeli stood a few feet from Ethan, her presence steady, her eyes holding his without challenge, without softness, just truth waiting to be seen. Behind her, the riders remained still, their horses quiet, their attention fixed not on him, but on her. Ethan did not move. He had learned that stillness could say more than any defense ever could. The wind brushed lightly across the dry grass, carrying the faint scent of leather and dust, and for a moment, it felt like the entire land had narrowed to the space between them. Nayeli lifted her hand slightly, not as a command, but as a signal, and from the line of riders behind her, one stepped forward. He guided his horse slowly, respectfully, and behind him, something small came into view. At first, Ethan thought it was a bundle, wrapped carefully in cloth, carried across the saddle with deliberate care. But then it moved. Subtle. Just enough to draw breath into the moment. The rider stopped a short distance away, and with quiet precision, he reached down, lifting what he carried into his arms before stepping down from the saddle. The cloth shifted again, revealing the face of a child, no older than 6 or 7, eyes dark and wide, watching the world with a calm that did not belong to someone so young. Ethan felt something in his chest tighten, not fear, not confusion, but recognition of something deeper than either. The rider stepped forward, closing the distance until he stood beside Nayeli, then gently lowered the child to the ground. The child did not run. Did not hide. Just stood there, small against the wide stretch of land, looking first at Nayeli, then slowly, carefully, at Ethan. Nayeli spoke then, her voice quiet but clear, each word measured, deliberate. 3 nights ago, she said, this horse ran through the canyon. She paused, her gaze shifting briefly toward the horizon as if seeing it again. There was a storm. The ground broke near the ridge. Her eyes returned to Ethan. My son was there. The word settled into the space between them, heavy without needing to be explained further. Ethan's eyes moved to the child again, taking in the way he stood, the steadiness in his small frame, the way he did not seem afraid, only aware. Nayeli continued, her voice unchanged. The horse carried him clear of the fall. She stepped closer now, not closing the distance fully, but enough that her presence could not be mistaken. It came back injured. Her eyes flicked once, almost imperceptibly, toward Ethan's hands, as if remembering the bandage, the care he had given without knowing what it meant. You returned what was not yours, she said. And you cared for what you could have kept. The riders behind her remained silent, but something in their posture had shifted again, something that spoke of agreement, of understanding that did not need to be voiced. The child took a small step forward then, his eyes still on Ethan, curious, unguarded, like he was trying to understand the shape of the man in front of him. Ethan did not step forward. He did not reach out. He simply stood there, letting the moment exist without trying to shape it into something else. Nayeli watched him closely, as if this part mattered just as much as everything that had come before. We do not forget, she said finally. Not a promise. Not a warning. Just a statement of something older than either of them. The wind moved again, softer now, and somewhere in that quiet, the meaning of her words settled deeper than anything that could have been handed to him. This was not about repayment. This was about balance. About a choice made when no one was watching, and what it set in motion after. The child stopped a few steps away from Ethan, close enough that the distance between them no longer felt like safety, but not so close that it assumed anything. He stood there, small boots pressed into the dust, hands relaxed at his sides, his gaze steady in a way that carried no fear, only quiet curiosity. Ethan met that gaze without forcing a smile, without softening into something that did not belong to him. Out here, children learn to read truth the same way men did. Without words. The wind moved gently through the open land, stirring the loose edges of the cloth still draped over the child's shoulders, and for a moment, everything felt suspended between what had already happened and what had not yet been decided. Ethan lowered himself slowly, not all the way to his knees, just enough to bring his eyes closer to the child's level, a gesture small enough not to threaten, honest enough not to pretend. The boy watched him carefully, tilting his head just slightly, as if measuring something he did not yet have a name for. Ethan reached into his pocket, his movements unhurried, and pulled out a small piece of leather, worn smooth at the edges from years of being carried more than used. It was nothing of value to most men. Just a simple carving of a horse, shaped by hand on long evenings when silence was the only company he had. He held it out, not pushing it forward, just offering it in the space between them, letting the boy choose whether to take it or leave it. The child looked at the carving, then back at Ethan, then at Nayeli for a brief second. She gave no signal. No nod. No instruction. Whatever this was, it belonged to the moment itself. The boy stepped forward, slow and certain, and reached out with both hands, taking the small piece of leather as if it carried more weight than its size suggested. His fingers traced the rough lines of the carving, the shape of the horse, the curve of its neck, and something in his expression shifted, subtle but real, like recognition meeting something new. Ethan let his hand fall back to his side, saying nothing. There was nothing to explain. The boy looked up again, holding the carving close to his chest now, and for the first time, there was a hint of something softer in his eyes. Not gratitude. Not yet. But something that leaned toward it. Behind them, one of the riders shifted slightly in the saddle, and the black horse stepped forward once more, guided gently by the reins of another. It came to stand beside the boy, lowering its head just enough to brush lightly against his shoulder, as if completing something that had begun days ago. Nayeli watched all of it without interruption. Her gaze moving between her son and Ethan, reading what did not need to be spoken. After a moment, she stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. He will remember, she said. Not as a promise, not as a burden, but as something certain. Ethan nodded once, his eyes still on the child, understanding that some things carried forward long after the moment itself had passed. The boy took a small step back then, returning to Nayeli's side, the carving still held carefully in his hands. The riders remained silent, but the air between them had changed again, the tension now replaced by something steadier, something grounded in respect rather than uncertainty. Ethan rose slowly, dust brushing from his knees, his posture returning to its usual calm. He had not asked for anything. He had not expected anything. And yet, standing there, watching the child and the woman and the riders who had come not for judgment but for something else entirely, he understood that this was the part most men never saw. Not the act itself, but what it left behind. The moment did not end with a command or a signal, it ended the way most things out here did, with quiet understanding moving through people without needing to be spoken aloud. Nayeli turned slightly, her hand resting briefly on her son's shoulder, not guiding him, just reminding him where he stood. The riders behind her shifted in unison, not sharply, not urgently, but with the kind of coordination that came from years of moving as one. And then, without ceremony, they began to act. One rider stepped forward leading a horse, then another, and another, until Ethan realized what he was seeing was not a single return, but a line. Horses. Strong, well-kept, each bearing the same markings, the same quiet strength as the one he had brought back. They came forward slowly, hooves pressing into the dirt of his land, not as a show of power, but as something placed carefully, deliberately, like stones set one by one to mark a truth that could not be undone. Ethan did not move. He did not step forward to count them, did not reach out to take hold of anything. He simply watched, his eyes steady, his expression unchanged, even as the number grew. 5. 10. More than he could have ever needed. More than any man in his position would have expected in a lifetime. The riders stopped just inside the edge of his corral, leaving the horses there, reins loose, trusting they would not scatter. Nayeli remained where she stood, her gaze fixed on Ethan, measuring not his reaction, but his understanding. You returned one, she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach him without rising above the stillness. She paused, letting the weight of what followed settle before she spoke again. We return what it carries. Ethan's eyes moved briefly across the horses, then back to her, and for the first time since they arrived, there was the faintest shift in his expression. Not surprise. Not gratitude. Something quieter. Something that held both recognition and restraint. He took a slow breath, the air dry in his chest, and shook his head once. Not in refusal of them, but in refusal of what they meant. That is not how it works, he said, his voice calm, steady, the same tone he had used when he first chose to return the horse. Nayeli did not react immediately. She watched him, waiting, as if this part mattered more than anything that had come before. Ethan stepped forward then, just one step, enough to make it clear he was not stepping away from what stood before him, but not closing the distance fully either. I did not bring him back for this, he said. The words were simple, but they carried the same weight as his earlier choice. Behind her, one of the riders shifted slightly, as if expecting something different, but Nayeli lifted her hand just enough to still any movement. Her eyes never left Ethan's. No, she said quietly. You did not. The wind moved through again, stirring the dust around their feet, brushing lightly against the horses now standing within his land, and for a moment, it felt like the balance of the entire place rested in what happened next. Ethan looked at the horses once more, then back at the child holding the small leather carving, then finally at Nayeli. He understood what this was. Not payment. Not trade. Something deeper. And yet, he also understood what accepting it would mean. Out here, a man was measured not by what he was given, but by what he chose to carry. He took another breath, slower this time, and his voice, when it came, did not rise, did not harden. It remained exactly what it had always been. Certain. Then I cannot take it. The words settled into the dust between them, quiet, unyielding, and for a brief second, everything stood still again, waiting to see what kind of man he truly was when the reward finally arrived. The words did not fall heavy, but they stayed where they landed, firm as a post set deep in dry ground. Ethan Cole stood there with nothing in his hands, nothing in his voice but certainty, and for a long moment, no one moved to challenge it. The horses shifted quietly within the corral, their presence strong but patient, as if even they understood that this was not a matter of ownership, but of something far less visible. Nayeli watched him without interruption, her eyes steady, searching not for weakness, but for truth that did not bend when it was tested. The wind passed between them again, softer now, carrying dust that settled slowly around their boots, and in that stillness, something changed. Not in him. Not in what he had said. But in how it was received. Nayeli took a step forward, closing the distance just enough that her voice would not need to travel far. Then you will not take what is given, she said, not questioning, not accusing, just naming what stood in front of her. Ethan shook his head once, the motion small but final. Not like this. The answer did not come quickly. She turned her head slightly, her gaze drifting over the horses, then to her son standing just behind her, still holding the small leather carving close to his chest. The boy looked back at her, then at Ethan, his expression quiet, but there was something in it now that had not been there before. Understanding. Not complete. Not fully formed. But enough. Nayeli stepped back then, her posture easing, not in surrender, but in acceptance of something that did not need to be forced. She spoke a few words to the riders behind her, low and calm, and this time, their movement followed without hesitation. One by one, they began to guide the horses away from the corral, turning them gently, leading them back toward the open land they had come from. No urgency. No disappointment. Just the quiet recognition that some things were not meant to be taken. Even when they were freely offered. All but one. The black horse remained. It stood near the edge of the corral, its dark coat catching the last of the afternoon light, its posture calm, as if it had already chosen where it belonged. Ethan's eyes moved to it, then back to Nayeli, and for the first time, there was a question there, unspoken but clear. Nayeli followed his gaze, then gave a slight nod. This one, she said, her voice steady, is not a gift. She paused, letting the meaning settle before continuing. It chose him. It carried my son when the ground fell away. It came back to you when it was hurt. Her eyes met Ethan's again, and there was no hesitation in what she said next. Now it stays where it is meant to stay. Ethan did not answer right away. He looked at the horse, at the quiet strength in it, the way it stood without pulling, without needing to be held. Then he stepped forward, slow, deliberate, closing the distance until he stood beside it. He reached out, his hand resting gently against its neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath his palm, the same as before, but different now in what it meant. He did not take the reins. He did not claim it with words. He simply stood there, and that was enough. Behind him, the riders had already begun to turn, their silhouettes moving back toward the horizon, the dust rising softly around them. Nayeli lingered for one last moment, her son at her side, watching Ethan not as a stranger, not as something separate, but as someone whose choice had crossed a line that could not be seen, only understood. Some things are not owned, she said quietly. They are honored. Then she turned, and they were gone, leaving the land as it had always been. Wide. Quiet. Unforgiving in its silence, and yet, in that silence, something remained. Ethan stood beside the horse until the last trace of dust disappeared, his hand still resting where it had been placed, his gaze steady on the horizon. He had not taken what was not his. And in doing so, he had been given something that could not be measured, could not be traded, and could never be taken away. Out here, that was the only kind of justice that mattered.